It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Al, I'd like to talk to you about policy and politics this morning. As you know, Vice President Harris is getting a lot of criticism for not being clear about her public policies after the convention. The Trump campaign has seized on this as a political advantage. But when you look at who the remaining undecided voters are, you wonder, does it really matter where she is on her policies at this point? Is it?
The answer is yes. It does matter where she is on her policies. I believe ideas matter in politics, and policies matter. I wrote a book on it, on an idea politics campaign. I taught a class in political messaging and political ideas at Johns Hopkins Graduate School. So I believe it's really important. And it's important for this reason. Ideas sort of define a candidate. They tell you where the candidate stands on the big issues. And they're important to reinforce the overall political strategy of a campaign. Our message, for example, in 1992, was that we were a different kind of Democrat. That was our strategy because Democrats have been losing presidential elections for a quarter of a century. People were voting against them, and we said if we don't redefine our party as being a different kind of Democrat, nobody's going to vote for us for president. And so we had a set of policies from welfare reform to national service, AmeriCorps, charter schools, community policing, all of which, many others, all of which challenged democratic orthodoxy. And so they gave us a definition of somebody that was pushing off the Democratic Party as well as going after George H.W. Bush with issues like the economy is stupid. But it gave us a definition of a different kind of Democrat because had we not redefined ourselves with our ideas, we were concerned that nobody would listen to us even on the issues they agreed with us on. So what I'd say is big ideas are important in a campaign. Policy details, every I dotted and every T crossed, not so important. Because what you want to deliver in a campaign are messages, not you don't want to get so far in the weeds that because you want messages that tell people where you're going to take them, not get in the weeds and get lost in the details of policy. The time to do the details of policy are either before the campaign starts or during the transition in the early days of the administration. Now, why do I say that? Because, as Craig knows, and it's probably worse in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party when you had a Republican Party, you have, during the campaign, you have all the interest groups and the constituency groups weighing in. Everybody's trying to get short-term political advantage in your policy, and that usually results both in bad politics and bad policy. So, if you can't, what we had done is we had a 2 or 3 year effort to develop a bunch of policies, and we ran on those in the campaign. The ones that were not as well developed and we tried to run on in the campaign didn't work out quite as well. So the answer is the big goals are important. The details of policy, not so important. But, the press is on, 24-hour cable gives you too much time to fill. And, they're jumping around. She laid out really important policy, directional policies or ideas in her speech. What's one of the major issues of the campaign? Abortion. Does anybody doubt what the two candidates' position is on abortion. She made she has working on an opportunity agenda. I mean, she didn't have the advantage that Trump had, that he had a 4-year campaign. He had plenty of time to develop his policies. She's been in there for 5 weeks. And so having all the details is not something that she can do while she's putting together a campaign. But, she's made it clear she's going to be tough on crime. Trump has his own position on crime. It's committing them. She's been, I thought, her language, and this was an important thing for us too, on the military and creating the strongest, most lethal military in the world. The last president who said that was Franklin Roosevelt, and in his 1944 acceptance speech. Those are important signals of what kind of president she wants to be, and that's the most important thing. She'll have her interview tonight. The press will probably jump up and down on a few details, but as long as she delivers a big message of where she wants to take the country, she'll do just fine.
Craig, Al makes a strong case for policy. But again, we're dealing with low information potential voters. How do you reach those people who have no interest in policy?
So I kind of I'd like to broaden the question a little bit and say, the way I think about it is, what influences a voter? And the answer to that has to be varied as the nature of voters. We used to sort of say, well, rule of thumb, in any political contest, you can count on about a third of the people being for you, a third of the people being against you. And the question is, how do you move the third in the middle? And there's not a third in the middle anymore. It's a smaller number. But this question of what influences the voter is what's always interested me. And in that context, I completely agree with Al. Policy is important because it's important to influence some voters. And in a race that's so close at the national level, certainly, some voters become very important. The other thing that's important about that is those voters who have a strong interest in policy, that are influenced by the position the candidate takes, typically have influence over other voters. So there's somebody in every neighborhood who's following all these issues and talking about them, perhaps appearing on shows like this. And people listen to that and say, well, gee, they've taken the time to really get behind the differences in voting records. They've taken the time to understand, which direction these candidates would go. And I feel more like X or Y. And so the person that cares about policy and issues becomes an influencer. And of course, the popular use of that term has to do with social media, but influencers have been around for a long time. And it used to be that the national parties themselves were great influencers. And you had people say, I vote the ticket. I'm voting Democrat or I'm voting Republican. And in a way, what that meant was, I trust the people who are most knowledgeable about the issues of the day, who are Democrats. That's why I'm going to be aligned with them, or I'm going to align with Republicans. Well, I think arguably the national parties play less of a role in that. Another, I think, sort of influencer factor is where you live. And that's one of our great challenges these days, is these homogeneous communities where people kind of think alike. So the influencer becomes the person at the country club, or the person in the school, or that moves voters. But at the end of the day, there are those people who care about these policies. Al raised another very important point, and that's how a campaign communicates about policy. And it's not just coming up with a list. The New York Times recently ran a comparison across a number of important issues in this campaign. Here's where Trump stands. Here's where Harris stands. It's a long list, and it was very interesting. But my guess is not a lot of people, read that. That's not how they absorb information about policies. I'll give you one example, and then I'll stop. And it goes back to the to the 84 campaign. Ronald Reagan ran in 1980 saying he'd do away with the Department of Education. So we take a little beating in the midterms, to say the least, in 82. Now we're approaching 84, and Dick Worthland, our pollster, wonderful fellow, comes in and he goes, actually education's pretty important to a lot of voters. And this notion that somehow we're going to do away with the department, which, by the way, we never took one step to do, is hurting us. About that same time, the Secretary of Education came in and said, I've had this quiet little group working on this document, and it's called A Nation at Risk. He meets with me, and he says, it's got a lot of smart people involved, and it really talks about how serious the education issue is. And I said, let's marry these two issues. Mike Devers set up a meeting. The Secretary of Education briefs the president with a couple of his commission members. And suddenly we had a new initiative. We didn't really change Ronald Reagan's attitude towards education. He always thought it was important. He just thought it was less a federal responsibility, more a state responsibility, local responsibility. But suddenly he started going to schools with a presidential scholarship award of excellence for the schools. And we did event after event after event. And the press started yelling at us about, oh no, another one of these. But what we were communicating was an attitude about education that resonated with a lot of voters, and the needle moved. So I do think policy is still important. I think the way people are influenced perhaps has changed over time, but it's still something that you can move the needle with voters, and in a race as close as the one we're going to face in November, that's something vital to do.
Al, last week you made an interesting point by pointing out that a lot of the Republican leadership was not at the Republican convention. And it is striking how many former Trump officials have basically said he should not be president of the United States, and yet most of them have not said that they will vote for Harris. And isn't it kind of a profile and courage moment? I mean, why would they hesitate if they've already said that this man is not qualified to be president? Why would they hesitate in saying, for this particular election, I'm going to vote for Harris?
I think in the end, a lot of them are probably going to vote for Harris. I don't have, they've already made one important statement by not going to the convention. In 1980, when Reagan ran in the first time and brought Craig to Washington, at our convention, there were only, I think, 37 members of the House who actually went as delegates to the Democratic convention. That really gave birth to the superdelegates, because we wanted to get the elected party back involved in the operations of the political party. There have been a number of Republicans and so many people who've worked in the Trump administration that say they don't want to support Trump. I think, I don't know whether they'll eventually come out and support Harris. Some of them are doing it. I think it'd be great if they would. But, part of what Harris has to prove in the, interview she's doing tonight with Dana Bash and in the debate is prove that she's an alternative, an acceptable alternative. If you go back to 1980, that race was polling very tightly throughout most of the race. And then there was the debate. And I had come to the conclusion a year earlier in 1979 that the American people wanted to get rid of Jimmy Carter. I was working in the White House, but I just came to that conclusion. They didn't want him as their president. Mm-hmm. But Reagan, remember, was considered old. He was a B-grade actor, all those things. And people just weren't quite sure that he was up to the job. That debate, which was only a week before the election, Reagan did a terrific job. He had those great lines like, "There you go again." And overnight, the race became a 10-point race. So obviously a lot of Democrats, and because there were more Democrats than Republicans in those days, who were worried, who didn't want Carter, but were worried about Reagan, said, okay, he's acceptable. And so, whether it's after this interview or after the debate or after some other thing, at some point they will make a decision. If they find that Harris is an acceptable alternative, I think a lot of them will come in the end and vote for her.
Greg.
That's your question about Republicans. For some reason, you caused me to think about an ad that ran in 1980, and it's one of my favorite ads, and most people won't remember it. Al will remember it, and you, I think, can look it up. It's called "A Bear in the Woods," and in this ad, the bear is a metaphor for the Soviet Union, and all the ad does is ask the question: Is it possible there's a bear in the woods? There might be a bear in the woods, and if there is a bear in the woods, shouldn't we be prepared? And it was a strong defense ad with not showing any weapon, not showing any missile, not really taking any position. The reason I'm thinking of that is I think that's almost the way Republicans think about Trump. And it's like okay, we're not going to go to his convention, but he's still out there and he could win and he could do me damage. So I'm not going to put my name on the list. More time goes by. Now there's a Republicans for Harris, organization forming. So now there's names on a list. Well, maybe I could put my name on the list, but they're still wary, and it's why I think until Donald Trump is defeated, there's going to be this wariness about just maybe going too far and damaging their own possibility for election or reelection. I can't quite explain it because I don't. If you so fundamentally disagree with somebody, I don't know why you don't say so, but that's where some of them are, and it's for that reason that we've said that that staying in office or winning office is all important to these men and women, and so they're very cautious when it comes to doing something that might be damaging. The question really, I think, is going to be if there is the chance to rebuild the party. Because the party, the Republican Party now is about one individual. So if he goes away, the rebuilding process honestly has to be, I think, more magnanimous than people want to admit. You can't just shun the number of people that voted, that were supportive of Trump. And my guess is they'll walk away fairly quickly since he seems to be loyal to almost no one except himself. And that's why I think the rebuilding is a real possibility, either in the period between the election and the midterms. It may take another beating to, get people, as Al knows, get people in the position of saying maybe we should try winning elections. It may take a while, but I suspect that rebuilding can occur, and I only hope that if there are Republicans who take the risk and go out and vote for Harris, that they're not shunned, that they have a role as well, that they didn't walk away from their party, they walked away from a candidate who they found unacceptable. But it's a very different time, and it's going to be a real challenge to try to put things back together again. And my guess is it'll take a whole nother election cycle or two before we see what's possible.
Yeah. Hey, before we close, I do feel like we have to close the chapter on RFK Jr. He suspended his campaign. He endorsed Donald Trump. I think there's an expectation he would get a cabinet position out of it. But that campaign is over, and maybe we should put a footnote on that as we close up today.
If this is the art of the deal, RFK Jr. got a bad deal. To be named the honorary co-chair of a transition team where already people inside the Trump organization are saying it's basically a figurehead. He doesn't really have a position. So he shopped himself to both campaigns, both candidates, and Trump said, "Yeah, sure, of course, come on board." I'm not sure. This is one of those things, and Al will relate to this too. This is one of those things where be very careful of the deal you make with somebody who has a very high view of himself, because if you don't get to where he is, he's just as likely to create another news story by walking out of the campaign, because he doesn't really have a role. And I think from a numbers standpoint, it's a non-event. He'd gone from low double digits to single digits to below 5% to about 4%. So he doesn't have a following that's going to make, I think, that's going to tilt the scale. My only question is this a deal that actually will ever stay done, or will he bolt at some point out of frustration?
Al, you do have the last word.
In the end, I think he's probably going to wind up hurting Trump more than he helps him. I mean, it's sort of a collection of crazies, and he's not, as it turns out, he's not going to be able to get off the ballot in important states like Wisconsin and Michigan. And, I spent the whole year being afraid that a third-party candidate with Biden on the ticket would take more votes from Biden. But with Harris on it, because people were voting against Trump, not for Biden. But people are now voting for Harris. And the reason for that precipitous drop in RFK's support is that all the RFK voters that would have ordinarily voted for Biden are now voting for Harris. And so what's left are the battle for the nutcases, who's more anti-vax, who would rather have a bear cub in their car, all those kinds of things. And, so if he stays on the ballot, those votes may not automatically go to Trump, and it may hurt Trump a little bit, not much, because they doesn't have much support left. But I mean, I think it's a deal where both parties deserve each other.
Well, we have to leave it there. Al, from Craig Fuller, thanks so much indeed. We will see you next week.